When I was 12, my sister disappeared for 3 days. My parents told me to say she was visiting an aunt. There was no aunt. She came home bruised and quiet. I asked her what happened, and she just said, "Don't ask." My parents told me if anyone asked, I had to stick to the story. I didn't even know how to lie yet. I rehearsed it in the mirror. At school, her best friend cried in the hallway. I said nothing. Years later, I found out where she'd really been, and why. When I was 12, my older sister Tessa disappeared for 3 days. My parents told me to say she was visiting an aunt if anyone asked. There was no aunt. She came home bruised and quiet. When I asked what happened, she just said, "Don't ask." Years later, I found out where she'd really been and why the lie had to be maintained. It was September, and 7th grade had just started for me. Tessa was 16, a junior in high school with a small circle of close friends. Our house was always quiet. Dad worked long hours at a manufacturing plant, and Mom kept herself busy with community activities. We weren't especially close as sisters, with the 4-year age gap feeling much wider than it actually was. On a Wednesday morning, I woke up to find Tessa's bed empty, which wasn't unusual. She often left early to meet her friends before school. But that evening, when I got home, she still wasn't there. Mom was in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones. I asked about Tessa after she hung up. Mom told me Tessa was visiting our Aunt Rita in Lakewood for a few days. When I pointed out we didn't have an Aunt Rita, Mom gripped the kitchen counter and instructed me to tell anyone who asked that exact story. No questions allowed. Just remember what she told me. Dad came home early that night. He and Mom spoke in their bedroom with the door closed. Their voices rose and fell, though I couldn't make out the words. When they emerged, Dad looked pale and angry. When I asked if Tessa was okay, he insisted she was fine and reminded me to remember what Mom had told me. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror practicing the lie about Aunt Rita in Lakewood. I repeated it with different inflections until it sounded natural. I'd never had to lie about something important before. The next day at school, Tessa's best friend, Bryn, cornered me in the hallway before first period. Her eyes were red and puffy. She demanded to know where Tessa was, saying she wasn't answering her phone. I recited my practice line about Aunt Rita. Bryn stared at me and stated plainly that we didn't have an Aunt Rita. I insisted we did. I claimed she didn't visit much. She started crying right there in the hallway. A teacher approached to ask what was wrong, but Bryn just walked away. I stood frozen, the lie feeling like a stone in my stomach. That evening, Mom received a call that made her grab her keys immediately. She told me to stay home, lock the doors, and not answer the phone. She was gone for hours. I sat on the couch, watching the clock, too nervous to eat dinner or do my homework. Around midnight, I heard a car in the driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Dad's car. He helped Tessa from the passenger seat. She moved slowly, keeping her head down. When they came inside, I gasped. Tessa had a dark bruise on her cheek and a split lip. She held her arms tightly around herself as if she was cold, though the house was warm. I ran toward her, asking what happened. She looked at me with empty eyes. "Don't ask," she said, then walked straight to our shared bedroom and closed the door. Mom followed after her with a plastic pharmacy bag. Dad sank onto the couch and put his head in his hands. When I tried to question him, he cut me off and reminded me about the Aunt Rita story. That was all anyone needed to know. For 3 days, Tessa stayed in our bedroom with the blinds drawn. She only emerged to use the bathroom. Mom brought her meals on trays that came back barely touched. I slept on the couch because Mom said Tessa needed space. On Sunday night, Mom and Dad had a long conversation with Tessa in the kitchen. I wasn't allowed to join them. Afterward, Mom informed me that Tessa would return to school the next day. If anyone asked about her bruises, I was to say she fell while hiking with Aunt Rita. On Monday, I watched Tessa carefully apply makeup to cover the bruise on her face before school. In the hallways, people stared and whispered. Bryn approached us before first period, her eyes wide at the sight of Tessa's injuries. When she asked what happened, Tessa mechanically replied that she fell while hiking at her aunt's house. Bryn looked like she wanted to say more, but Tessa walked away before she could. Throughout the day, I saw Tessa avoid her usual friends, keeping her head down and speaking minimally. Weeks passed, and slowly things seemed to return to normal on the surface. Tessa went back to her regular schedule. She stopped wearing heavy makeup to cover her face as the bruises faded. But something fundamental had changed. She stopped having friends over. She came straight home after school. She jumped at loud noises. Once, when we were alone in our room, I tried again to ask what really happened when she was gone. Tessa looked at me for a long moment and told me she needed me to never ask that again. It was better if I didn't know. Months passed, then years. Tessa graduated and left for college 2 states away. She rarely came home, even during holidays. Our parents never pushed her to visit. The questions about those 3 days faded to the background of our family life, but never disappeared completely. I was 18 when pieces of the truth began to emerge. Home from my first semester of college for winter break, I was cleaning out my closet when I found an old small box of middle school memorabilia. Inside was my diary from 7th grade with entries about Tessa's disappearance and return. Reading it brought back all my questions. That night, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen, not realizing I was home. Mom mentioned seeing Oscar's mother at the grocery store, saying his family had moved back to town. Dad immediately asked if she had said anything about Tessa. Mom replied that she had pretended not to see her, which Dad seemed relieved about. I froze in the hallway. Oscar. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Later that night, I searched through Tessa's old yearbooks until I found him, Oscar Reyes, 2 years ahead of Tessa in school. I vaguely remembered him as Tessa's boyfriend during her sophomore year before her disappearance. The next day, I drove to Bryn's house. We hadn't spoken much since high school, but her parents still lived in the same house, and she was home for the holidays, too. When we were alone, I asked her about Tessa's disappearance. Bryn looked uncomfortable and said that was a long time ago. I pressed her, asking if she knew Tessa wasn't visiting an aunt. After a pause, she acknowledged that everyone knew there was no aunt, but my parents had made it clear they weren't supposed to ask questions. When I asked if it had something to do with Oscar Reyes, her eyes widened slightly. She seemed surprised I didn't know. Bryn explained that Oscar had been bad news, controlling and jealous. Tessa had tried to break up with him multiple times, but he always convinced her to come back. When I asked if he had hurt Tessa, Bryn said I should really talk to my sister about this. I called Tessa that night. She sounded surprised to hear from me. We rarely spoke on the phone. I told her I needed to know what happened when I was 12, when she disappeared for 3 days. After a long silence, she asked why I was asking about this now. I explained that I was tired of not knowing, tired of having lied for her for years without understanding why. Eventually, she said she would come home the next weekend so we could talk in person. Tessa arrived on Friday evening. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, and she carried herself with more confidence than I remembered. We waited until our parents went to bed before sitting at the kitchen table with mugs of tea. When I asked her to tell me everything, Tessa took a deep breath and began explaining. She had been with Oscar.